Okay, so just to get started, I'll describe the Mistakis Institute. Some of you I know are aware of the Mistakis Institute, but some aren't. We're a not-for-profit charitable applied research institute, like I mentioned, at Mount Royal University in Calgary. We have a goal of seeing a world where communities have genuine access to the science and research they need to make choices that promote healthy landscapes. And the work that we do in support of that is to try and get that innovative research in an accessible way to the communities and decision makers, anybody who makes a decision that has an impact on the sustainability of landscapes. So today what I'm going to talk about is the Working with Nature toolkit that we've recently completed. I'm going to give you a little bit of background information on that and talk about why we worked to create this Working with Nature toolkit, how it evolved. There's a couple of things that I think it's important to understand how it was created and some of the things that came before it, but I'm going to spend the majority of my time just talking about what the whole thing is. And then some more specific information on the toolkit itself. I've got a section with a couple of options, different things that users of the tool can use, and I'll finish up with all of the information, the detailed information about where exactly to get the Working with Nature toolkit. So to start with, like I said, why create something like Working with Nature? Well, the context that we came at this from was a recognition that the responsibility for flood and drought is falling largely to municipalities, and probably disproportionately to municipalities, and in terms of having to prepare for, having to react and respond to. In those conversations, there is a lot of discussion about natural infrastructure and a lot of looking to natural infrastructure as potentially a key part of the solution, but that awareness for municipalities is a little bit spotty in terms of accessing information that's actually usable. And there really is not a lot of information, not a lot of support for municipalities who have decided that they want to try and apply a natural infrastructure approach. The good news is over the last several years that has been increasing dramatically, and hopefully will just continue that way. One of the things that you bump into immediately is the question of what is natural infrastructure. And if you have 10 people in the room, you're going to have 12 different definitions of what natural infrastructure is. What we did with the Working with Nature program was list a description of where we started from in terms of what is natural infrastructure, but this whole toolkit is about flexibility and about adaptability. So municipalities can use that list, they can change that list. It's the reason that there's question marks at the end there. So the need that we identified, that we thought existed for municipalities, is first of all a decision support tool. Lots of things are decision support tools, but specifically for incorporating natural infrastructure into municipal processes, and one that fits the existing municipal processes. We were conscious that sometimes there's a tendency to create something that isn't fit within the ways that municipalities make decisions, the kinds of planning processes they have, the kinds of decisions that they make. We wanted it to be cross-departmental, cross-policy, not just sit with one particular department, one particular lens on a municipality. We wanted to go beyond a discovery tool. That's a term that talks about mechanisms that you can use to get more information about an issue. And we did create one of those called Adaptation some time ago. I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a second, but there's the website for that. And those are ones that give you information, but we wanted to have something that would actually be very specific for decision support. We wanted a simple, inexpensive interface, not requiring complex interface, not requiring specialized software. And so we hope that this would be something that medium-sized or even small-sized municipalities would be able to access. And then we wanted to have it real-world tested. So that was a big part of the project, was doing that. I'll talk about that in a second as well. So the Working with Nature program at Mistakis evolved based on a couple of other things that had happened that we've been doing before. Like I mentioned, the first one, Adaptation, was an online tool that was intended to help support climate change resiliency in Alberta municipalities. A web tool that when you went on for the different modules there, adapting to water scarcity, adapting to floods, then you'd be able to see for each one of those what were the environmental changes and effects that you would need to be concerned about. How does that link to the implications that what's actually happening in your community? And then how does that link to strategies that you might take? So kind of making that a linear connection, but allowing you to drop in at the strategies and work your way back and find out what are some of the implications that those strategies might speak to. Like I said, that's still online at adaptaction.ca. It's also something that we've incorporated in the resources for working with nature. So we took all of the information associated with each one of those modules and combined it all into a standalone document, a PDF document, and that's in with the resources with the toolkit. The next thing we did was a municipal flood and drought action primer. And the idea here was to give basic background information for municipalities. How do you identify, how do you articulate the rationale for flood and drought mitigation action? And then where are some of the resources, the data sources that you can go to get that basic information? Some municipalities have a lot of capacity and have developed that information for themselves. Others are looking at provincial information or third-party information to try and gather that background case, and that's what that was intended to provide. And again, that's in with the Working with Nature resources. The next thing that we wanted to do was make sure that, remember I said that we wanted this real world tested, we wanted to have a pilot for Working with Nature, and we were very lucky to have the town of Cochrane agree to be our pilot partner. So Cochrane worked through the entire workshop process, through the entire workbook, and we went back and forth, and we actually made a number of modifications to what we're presenting to you today based on that feedback, based on what we learned in that whole process. And our contact at Cochrane is Amanda Legros, the planner there. And shout out for Amanda. She was awesome to work with. And she also agreed to allow me to put up all of her information here. So her email, amanda.legros@cochrane.ca, is a great way to get in touch with her, especially if you want to ask questions about what did you like, what did you not like, what did this do for you, what was the situation that you were trying to address within the town of Cochrane. I think that's important information for municipalities to have. Okay, so I've talked in circles around this now. What is working with nature? So working with nature is a process. It's a step-by-step process that municipalities can use. It helps them identify their natural infrastructure and the natural infrastructure assets, and then determine the actions that you should take to better employ that infrastructure, specifically in mitigating flood and drought risks. So that's the encapsulating description of the entire thing. So what that actually looks like is there are 5 primary components to the Working with Nature process. And each one of these components is dealt with in a couple of different ways, but the whole point is to flesh them out with this, what we hope is an easy to navigate set of tasks and meetings, and then capturing all of that in the Working with Nature workbook. And I'm going to go through each one of those primary components in a second and give you a little bit more detail about it, but it's goals and principles, hazards and risks, the actual natural infrastructure, the actions that you would take, and then the final step, converting that into policy. So the 3 W's of Working with Nature workshops. So the intent of the workshops is to allow the municipal personnel, and I'll be referring to them as the natural infrastructure team, to collect and vet the information as a group. It's really important for that interaction as a group. Worksheets. So the Working with Nature toolkit includes all of these pieces. They're all pre-made, they're all ready there, and they're in 2 different forms, in a Microsoft Word form and in a PDF form. You can just print them off, or you can adapt them and change them. But this is to capture all of the input of the individual participants at different points throughout the entire process. And then the starting point and the final product both is the workbook. So the work of the participants throughout all of those components is gathered here in the workbook, and that becomes a living document for the municipality. It can be changed, added to, and always drawn from to inform different things that the municipality is going to do. And like I said, I'll talk about all of that in a little bit more detail. So these 5 primary components, there's actually 6, because the getting started is a really important part as well. So I'm going to talk through each one of those just a little bit. The getting started is really about establishing the beginning of the process. You get senior leadership support, you identify a natural infrastructure team, a team leader. All of these are kinds of probably basic things that you already have mechanisms for doing, but the whole point of the getting started section is to help make sure that you've done all of those things. Make sure you have that checklist. And then it's all about helping you identify exactly how you as a municipality would dive into the Working with Nature materials. And at this point, the reading through this information is, I kind of describe it as the kicking the tires. It gives you an idea of all of the things that you could do to try and better employ your natural infrastructure. Is this the one? Is this the one that you want to take for your municipality? So the goals and principles is a set of, again, exercises, mechanisms to get the participants to articulate what they hope their efforts are going to lead to, the goals, and then how they plan to operate in the course of getting there, the principles. And sometimes that seems like an obvious step, but in the context of this whole workbook, and especially that endpoint, it's really important to have this articulated. These are touchstones that you can continue to come back to throughout the entire process. Hazards and risk as a whole, there's actually several components around the hazard and risk that help the participants articulate what the hazards are. And it uses risk management terminology. There's a difference between hazards, risks, all of the components of a more robust risk management process. But the hazards are the bad situations you're worried about. So a flooded area, homes flooded, your downtown area flooded, that kind of thing, the bad situation you're worried about, articulating all of those, and then articulating the risks, the losses that you'd expect if those bad situations happen. So property damage or loss of life or loss of use of certain areas. So you articulate both of those things to get a real strong sense of what it is that you are trying to address by using your natural infrastructure. And then that's the next part, is getting the participants to actually identify, map, catalog the actual natural infrastructure assets in their community. And like I noted at the beginning with that table, this can include the fully natural and the built or engineered features, different initiatives, different documents will describe that differently. So the Insurance Bureau of Canada will describe it one way. The Municipal Natural Assets Initiative will describe it in a different way. It doesn't really matter exactly how they're all doing it. It's looking at those and coming up with what works for your municipality. And then this is the rubber hits the road, the actions. This gets the participants to actually identify and provide the details for each one of these actions. So the details are, again, the things you would expect around timing, who's leading it, costs, all of that kind of information that you would take to better employ the natural infrastructure in your community. And it's important to point out that the way working with nature is structured is to allow a municipality to go in as deep or as shallow as they feel they are able to. It might be a question of resources, it might be a question of different types of capacity, but you can identify this in a cursory way, you can identify it in a detailed way, but it's up to the municipality to figure that out. The next piece of this, after you've got your list of actions, is the prioritization. I'll talk about that. It's a whole set of optional tools that you can use within the Working with Nature process. And then the end point is the policy development. And as we go through the getting started, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, when we get down to the policy development, we're getting into a space that's more and more difficult to be prescriptive, to articulate exactly what this would be about. But the intent here is to get participants to make that final step from you've completed your workbook, you have that information, but that does not a policy make or a plan make. So it's the next step to help you walk through what you're going to do with that. Convert it into bylaws, convert it into a standalone strategy, integrate it in different work plans. There's a number of different options there, and every municipality is going to do it differently, but this step is to help you articulate that, determine the best way for your municipality to take that information that's gathered and put in the context of your municipality. So when you think about all of those components, within the Working with Nature process, it lays out through a number of gatherings, a number of meetings. So they don't all happen individually. Numbers 1, 2, and 3, so the goals and principles, hazards and risks, and natural infrastructure all happen in the first workshop. And we propose that being a one-day workshop. The actions are a separate workshop unto itself. Again, propose that being a full-day workshop or most of a day. And then the last one could be considered a workshop, but we think of it as a policy meeting. That's the coming back together. And the way Working with Nature is designed is we have tried to provide as much information as possible for you to be able to self-facilitate. You could get an external facilitator to help you with this. And for Cochrane, it was Mestakis who facilitated it for them. But what we wanted to create was an entire toolkit that allowed you to self-facilitate if that was the direction that you wanted to take. So those are the meetings, but there are a number of tasks as well that sort of slot in between the meetings. So between your decision to get started and going into that workshop 1, there's a number of pieces of background research that you need to do. And again, it can be scaled. You can dive in a lot of detail. We're just suggesting that you gather some basic information to inform your discussion about the hazards and risks, to inform your discussion about the natural infrastructure, so that you have that in place when you get everybody together into the room. After that first workshop, you've got a whole bunch of information, and this is where the team leader, the chief cat herder, has to gather all of that information from the workshop. Those worksheets can be completed afterwards. You would have established the schedule and the timeline for that. All of that comes back in, and then the workbook itself gets cleaned. And that leads you into the workshop to do the actions. After the actions are done again, you may, in the course of the workshop, have only sort of in a cursory way listed what some of those, there needs to be a step of detailing all of those actions, the things that you didn't know at the workshop that you want to add in. And then, like I said, there's an option for prioritizing those actions. At that point, it's safe to say that your workbook is quote unquote finalized. You have fully completed all of the tabs. I'll show you those in just a minute. You've fully completed inserting all of the information, and you have cleaned it up. So your standalone resource, this workbook, is complete. But you still need to go into the policy development meeting, and you take that information into the policy development meeting, and then out of that, you're ready to take action in whatever mechanism that it turns out that would be. So the workbook itself, I'm not going to go through this in detail because you'll have all of the files and you can see them, but the idea is that we built it around an Excel workbook. And we went back and forth on this because Excel is not super familiar to a lot of people, but it's also something that's relatively accessible. And in terms of, like I said, we didn't want to have specialized software that was required. So what we tried to do was make it as simple as possible, pre-format everything as much as possible. All of the sections are color-coded to make you clear, make you aware where you are in the entire process. And then each one of the tabs or worksheets within the workbook relates to those major primary components. So you've got hazards information, your goals, hazards information, risks information, the natural infrastructure information gathered. I'll talk a bit about how we did that with Cochrane, and then ultimately the actions that you're going to take forward. Okay, so that's the process. That's how you actually walk through it all. What did we create? What is the resource package for you? We call that the Working with Nature Toolkit. So the toolkit has essentially a variety of folders within it. It's a zip file. It's a set of folders with all sorts of information in there, laid out in a stepwise mechanism so that you can follow through and get all of the pieces of the Working with Nature process done. So you can see that these folders relate to some of the things that I was just talking about, but not exactly directly. There are some things that happen in between these tasks, and some things that you're gathering other information. But to take those folders and tell you what you have in there, the getting started one, like I said, it's got all of the introductory information. What is this Working with Nature thing? What do you mean by components? What are the requirements that we as a municipality would have to have in place, and the sequence that I was describing in more detail, and then those resources. The workbook is the workbook, that Excel workbook with tabs for each component, but there's also some tips in there about the actual process of using the workbook, printing things off and changing the views for the people who are not so familiar with Excel. The first workshop, again, we try and make this so that it can be self-facilitated, so there are resources in there of a suggested approach, how you could put all of that together, how you would guide people through that discussion, a suggested agenda, and then all of the worksheets and all of the information sheets, background information sheets that we think would be needed in workshop one, those are all included in there as well. And like I said, the Word version as well as the PDF version, so you can add, change, do whatever you want to those. I should note that in the toolkit, one of the things that we also include is a Creative Commons license, meaning you can't commercialize this and sell it, but aside from that, you can use it however you want, and there's no cost associated with that. So workshop 2, it's different workshop, but same kinds of materials in there. Suggested approach, suggested agenda, the workshops, and the info sheets that we think you would need. Now, the prioritization, like I said, it's an optional thing, but all of the more robust prioritization process, all of the tools there for prioritizing, weighting criteria, averaging action scores, all of that information and all of the worksheets are included in that folder. And then the policy development, kind of similar to the workshops. You have your suggested approach, your suggested agenda. And then, like I said, it's really difficult to describe all of the possible routes that might happen. What we try there is to make sure that we have as many things that you should be thinking about identified there to help you put that together. So maintaining the strategy, the monitoring the strategy, oversight of the strategy, or maybe you don't have it completed yet. All of the things that you need to do, as well as are we converting this to a bylaw? Are we inserting this into practices and guidelines? Just giving you the raw material for that discussion, but where you end obviously is going to be specific to your municipality. Okay, so diving into the options a little bit. This is a fully formed option, the prioritization option. So you actually have, again, two approaches, and one is very scaled down. It's just a simple 1-to-4 prioritization directly in the Working with Nature workbook. It's the last column over on the Actions tab, and you can just get everybody to rate it as a 1-to-4. But there's also a much more, like I said, robust rank order calculation using these different Excel spreadsheets so that you can, through a mechanism of getting participant input, identify relative to each other which ones you think that you should be starting with. So that prioritization is facilitated by the team leader. It happens after the Actions workshop through a number of email conversations and sending these sheets out to be filled in and then sent back, all of that collated by the team leader. And the result is a relative ranking of all of the actions. And then that can be fed back into the workbook. So there are 3 components to this, the overall prioritization tool. If the criteria in there you don't want to all count the same, you might want to weight those criteria. You have an option of doing that, and you have an option of doing that weighting it through an engaged process with your participants and everybody putting in their input as to how they think the different criteria should be weighting. And then a mechanism for just averaging. Again, we try and automate as much of this as possible so that you just have to plug the numbers in and it'll come up with the scores. Plus, there's all of the instructions for how to operate all of these. So the second option I wanted to talk about is the natural infrastructure mapping option. Unlike the prioritization one, this one is not done, but I wanted to talk through how we did this. So with Cochrane, what we did was we printed out imagery of the entire municipality, and during the workshop, and it's identified within the workshop materials where this would happen, we got everybody broken into groups to actually start identifying where they see the natural infrastructure assets within the community, within the town. So in this whole process, some of the challenges that we know that we face is, first of all, there has to be agreement on what is meant by natural infrastructure assets. Questions that came up were, do we just identify the things that currently exist, or maybe the places where there's a potential for storing a wetland or installing a green roof or that sort of thing? The green roof one came up a lot with are we just identifying opportunities on municipal land or private land, private buildings or private properties that we think could play a role in providing that natural infrastructure asset? So it doesn't really matter what you choose as long as you explicitly choose, because you can have different strategies related to those. We did this whole tool for flood and drought mitigation, so natural infrastructure for flood and drought, but there's a variety of other things that you might be looking at, like mitigating wildfire or providing for biodiversity. So the natural infrastructure mapping or asset mapping may speak to a number of different things. And again, it would be great to do that. You just have to be clear about that in the beginning. And then the raining on the parade, the data limitations. So we come up with all sorts of wonderful ideas of what we'd like to map, but we may not necessarily have the data for that. The flip side of all of this is that the opportunities that got represented to us were clarity, both for planning, so we can see that laid out in a spatial way, but for communications. Communications to the community, communications to council or to other departments to say, when we're talking about natural assets, natural infrastructure assets, we're talking about this stuff, and here it is. This is what we mean. And as we move forward, this is what we mean as we try and figure out how to use it better or identify more. The opportunity for an individual asset identify multiple benefits, because that's not something that we necessarily do. We kind of identify things for somewhat single-use, single-purpose issues. The idea of identifying assets is really important, and I know a lot of municipal people understand this, is that the municipalities often set up structured to consider budgeting and resourcing and planning around the assets that you're responsible for. So inserting this information into that lexicon and into those mechanisms is much easier when you have mapped that data. And much data does exist, but sometimes it's a question of reforming that data, repurposing that data, than it is going out and getting new data. The other thing is there's a lot of existing case studies that help support both the creation of it, but also like the methodology, how you do it, but also the cost-benefit analyses and the numbers and that sort of thing. You don't have to reinvent the wheel every single time. So like I said, this one's not done. Our next steps for Mistakis is to develop a municipal natural infrastructure GIS methodology. And the idea here is to see as much as possible how, again, that medium to small size municipality could crosswalk their existing GIS data into a natural infrastructure layer. So you might have gathered information for a different purpose, for stormwater management, for planning, for urban forestry, but you won't call it a natural asset, a natural infrastructure asset. You might be calling it something else. Well, what's required in kind of crosswalking that so that you can use that information to represent the full picture of your natural infrastructure? We've applied for funding and we're waiting to hear. Okay, so all of this stuff, where do you get it? You get the Working with Nature toolkit and all of that information off of the Mistakis Institute webpage. Kind of two ways to do it. One is just go straight to rockies.ca/WWN, and it'll take you right to the project page that has that information. If you're already on the webpage, the rockies.ca webpage, you go to the Municipalities and Conservation Research theme and navigate to the Working with Nature tab that will give you the information about the project and anything else that's loaded there, and that's where you find the toolkit. And you can download the toolkit directly from there. Like I said, it's just click and it's yours. There's a Creative Commons license that you have to abide by, but aside from that, you can use it however you want or in whatever ways that you think is most useful for your municipality. I think it's important to note that all of this information is free. There's no cost. There is no registration requirement for you to get that. Like you're not signing away your firstborn in order to get this quote unquote free thing. Just go on, click, and you get it. And that is because of our funder, and I want to say thanks to our funder, the Alberta government, specifically the Watershed Resilience and Restoration Program, who funded this. And I also want to do a shout out to our pilot partner, Cochrane, Town of Cochrane. They were great to work with, and we really learned a lot. They were also very good at providing feedback that's not just our town, but people in our situation would be looking at this kind of need or this kind of lens, this kind of perspective. So like I said, the Working with Nature toolkit is at rockies.ca/WWN, but this is my contact information, and if you have any questions for me, if you would like to have a copy of the slide deck, I can certainly send that to you. Just email me at that address or contact me at that phone number. It's a single line into the office, so if somebody else answers, yes, it is the right phone number. It's just the one that we all use. So with that, I have the chat box up. I haven't seen that anybody has listed any questions, but if there are any questions that anyone has, we've got some time to take those questions. Like I said, just bring up your chat box and type those questions in there. I'll also note, like with my contact information, if you're like me, about 5 minutes after you sign off of the webinar, you have a question, just contact me later, and I'm more than happy to answer questions. And the last thing I'll note is that same place where I said you could get the toolkit, that's where we're going to put a link to this recording and probably a link to the slide deck as well at some point, hopefully soon, so you can get all of that information there as well. And I don't see anybody posting any questions, so I think that indicates that I was 100% crystal clear on every aspect of the presentation, or I went so fast nobody understood it and they're just still processing. But either way, like I said, that's my contact information. So if anybody has any questions about the Working with Nature toolkit, please just let me know. There are a couple of questions here. Just curious if there's a field inspection component in the toolbox regarding flood and drought. That's a good question. So from the getting started into that first workshop, the background research part of it, this is where you can dive in as deep as you want or as shallow as you want. You might just have different aspects of what our flood risk is at a high level, what our drought risk is at a high level, basic background information, or you might go a lot deeper and require some of that field inspection. The other thing is you might get to the end to the actions and go, we have this particular action, but we really can't follow through with it until we have done that field inspection component. So that becomes part of the action plan and might be prioritized higher. So there's two places that could come in. And I'm going to move to the next question, but Clint, let me know if I missed something important in your question. So the next question is, what modifications would be needed to include other risks and hazards? Also a really good question, something that we've been wondering about as well. I think that it's relatively straightforward because we create a tab for each one of the sets of risks and hazards. So there's risks and hazards for flood, risks and hazards for drought. You could add in other components there, risks and hazards for wildfire. Then the nice thing about that, I think, is that you'll find as you get into your actions, you will be identifying actions that probably address a number of those risks, a number of those hazards as well. And so we haven't specifically talked about the expansion, but I think the expansion would be relatively straightforward. And can you describe how important it is to ID risks and hazards before the natural infrastructure inventory? Natural infrastructure inventory. That's an interesting question. So you've because Heather knows this so well, you've dived into the chicken and egg thing that you have. Sometimes until you've identified your natural infrastructure, you're not really certain about the ways that you can use it or the benefits that it can apply. But then sometimes to get the support to be able to step forward and do those things, you have to identify exactly why you're doing it. So I think that each municipality is probably going to have a different answer to that question. But I think at a very minimum, you need to identify your risks and hazards enough to inform when you get to the infrastructure identification stage that you're tying those things together. That, oh, that is a natural infrastructure asset that I can clearly see will help mitigate this risk. And if you're not able to draw those things back, then you can get down some pretty significant rabbit holes of just identifying everything. And then you actually circle back into that question of, well, what is natural infrastructure assets anyway? When you've done that risk and hazard assessment, it can help you focus. It can help you scope better. Okay. I don't see any other questions coming in, but I'll say again, if you have any other questions, please just contact me directly there. And thank you all very much for taking part in this webinar.